Hello everyone, today we're starting a 5-part series. It's going to be really exciting, and it's called What Could Have Been, and that's going to be about what could have happened had history gone a little bit differently, and today we'll be covering the 1970s Boston Bruins. Now, before we start, please make sure to join the Hockey Brigade by subscribing if you are new, and get ready because this could be a little bit longer of a video. So first off, I want to say, why am I even starting in the 70s and not even further back? Well, my answer is really simple, and that is because there were only 6 teams, that being the original 6, and those teams consisted of Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, New York, and Toronto in the NHL from the 1942-43 season to the 1966-67 season through those seasons. And so there really isn't a lot of teams to create parity. Then the league expanded from 6 teams to 12, that 1967-68 campaign, thus creating more parity. However, those new teams didn't start playing till the late 60s, so I felt like the 70s was a clean slate to start off. Obviously, those expansion teams were still struggling a bit because they couldn't compete for the most part early on with the original 6 teams, but it felt like a good start, which led me to make a decision for being who would have benefited the most from history going differently in the 70s. And while the Chicago Blackhawks and the New York Rangers were undoubtedly runner-ups for the decade, since they both went 0-2 in Stanley Cup Finals during this decade, I had to go with the Bruins, who made it to to hockey's grandest stage 5 times during the decade, that being 1970, 1972, 1974, 77, and 78. The problem is, they only went on to win 2 Stanley Cups and were beaten their final 3 appearances, and the last 2 were by their hated rivals, the Montreal Canadiens. But first, let's focus on the start of the decade. Coming into the 1970 playoffs, Boston has had this bad feeling. They had potential, but they were shaking off 2 consecutive years of being knocked out of the playoffs by Montreal in 1968 and 1969. And this also, going into this decade, the 1970 playoffs, was the first season Bobby Orr hit 100 points on the year, making him the first defenseman ever to do so in a campaign. And the good times from the regular season continued to roll as they captured the Stanley Cup title for the first time since 1941, ending their 29-year cup drought by beating the St. Louis Blues in a sweep, with Orr scoring the iconic series-winning goal in overtime. You look back, you see those photos. Orr, that is his legacy right there. That one photo just captures it all. 2 years later, they'd be back on top of the hockey world, this time by beating the New York Rangers in 6 games, with 3 players leading the Bruins for series points, that being Ken Hodge, the great Phil Esposito, and then, surprise, surprise, Bobby Orr. But, and this is the real part of this series of what could have been, the next 3 Stanley Cup Finals did not go well for them, as in the final 3 appearances, they lost all those in this decade. And this gives us our first chance to change history in this video. That will be the 1974 Stanley Cup Finals, and this, the starting point, will be Game 2 against the Philadelphia Flyers. This is where Boston had a 1-0 series lead, and they actually had a 2-1 lead in the game with just over a minute to go, but then Philly pulled Hall of Fame goalie Bernie Perrant, and then they went on to score to tie up the game, which sent it to OT before Bobby Clarke scored the game-winning goal in overtime, making the series go to 1-1. Instead, we're going to see the Bruins hold on to the lead, then they take a 2-0 series lead before they win Game 3, just like they did in the original timeline. And we'll say Philly wins Game 4, like the original timeline, but Boston wins it back at home in Game 5. With this change, it would extend the streak where the original 6 teams won, and then the expansion teams still hadn't beat the original 6 teams in the Stanley Cup Finals, and Boston would have won the title as heavy favorites. They were very big favorites coming into the Stanley Cup Finals, and they had the top record in the league that year. So, obviously, they would be champions in 1970, 72, and 74, 3 times in 5 years. With that being said, this leads us up to our next Stanley Cup Final matchups, and these are way more difficult to talk about. 1977 and 1978, the Spoked Bees ran into the buzzsaw that was the late 70s Montreal Canadiens. For those of you that don't know, Montreal won 4 straight Stanley Cups in this time span to end out the decade from 1976 to 1979. I wish I could have been alive, because this was probably the peak, or one of the peaks, of Montreal Canadiens history. It would have been really cool to see. And just to emphasize how good this team was, here's some fun facts about them. They went 229, 46, and 45 in regular season play during this time, with their best season coming in the 76-77 season with a record of 68-12 in an 80-game season. Keep in mind, ties still existed, so you got to think 229 wins, 46 losses, and then 45 ties. That is insane. Then in the playoffs, they went on a staggering 48-10 run in that span with a 16-3 record in the Stanley Cup Finals. And only once in that 4-year stretch did they ever go to a Game 7, that being the 1979 semifinals against Boston. Kind of interesting there, but that was the only time in that 4-year stretch they ever faced a Game 7. They also had 9 future Hall of Fame players on their team, and they beat the Bruins in those 77 and 78 Cup matchups, with 77 being a sweep. There are so many hard factors to pin down on this, but let's primarily say, in order to change history, Bobby Orr doesn't get ravaged by injuries, and his as opposed to his normal timeline where, a lot of injuries really hit him up, and then his relationship with the organization was better when the new ownership came in. It started off okay, then it faded obviously because of his injuries. Assuming he's healthy and the team beat the Flyers in 74, they would have won 3 Stanley Cups in 5 years, and maybe even Esposito doesn't get traded because obviously he didn't want to give up playing time back in the day, so they kind of make a beef up. They try to beef up this team again to keep it going. Regardless, we'd see the Bruins make different moves, obviously, than the previous timeline, and let's say somehow they magically upset the Habs in 1977. I'm not sure how they do it. I had to just run through this one because for the most part, Montreal was able to get the better of them in this series. So let's just say they magically do it. So boom, they win in 77, leaving the final matchup in 1978 where Boston ended up losing in 6 games. But this is a series where I could have seen it going a different way. Had they been able to flip the 3-2 overtime loss result in Game 2 of that 1978 series, they would have been able to take a 2-0 series lead before beating Montreal, I'm going to say, in either 6 or 7 games. So, that's how they do it. To recap, let's see what would have been different in terms of legacy for the Bruins of the 70s. So, instead of 2 titles, obviously they have 5, and they'd save themselves a lot of frustration. This is the main part of the Bruins in the 70s. You look at how it started, those 2 Stanley Cup wins, obviously huge, but the final 3 appearances, disheartening for a couple of reasons. The first one being, had they won, they wouldn't have been the first original 6 team to lose to an expansion team. That is always something that's going to be attached to this 70s Bruins team, as well as the franchise. It's got to be frustrating because nobody wants to be the first when it comes to losing to whatever it be. And so that happened there. The second is, they would not have lost to Montreal back-to-back years. And instead of Montreal winning 4 straight Stanley Cups on the back end of the decade, Boston fans would have been able to smile knowing that they were able to sandwich 2 Stanley Cups in between 76 and 79, only giving Montreal 2 Stanley Cup wins instead of 4, and the decade would have been able to end out on a more positive note for the franchise, knowing that they spoiled Montreal's run a little bit there. Now, multiple Bruins, of course, including Bobby Orr, would have had more titles on top of this, as well as pushing the cup total for the Boston franchise from 6 to 9 instead. Obviously, we do know this didn't happen, but it's still fun to talk about and imagine about with this different reality because, again, we would have been talking probably, obviously Montreal would have been talked about because they won multiple cups in the decade, even if you take those 2 away from them for Boston winning, but Boston would have been the team of the decade, so it is really fun to see that. Finally, I'd like to say this video did cover a lot of topics in a lot of time. Obviously, a whole decade is a big thing to go through, and I would say that obviously I know one thing likely would have changed. Other things had Boston won in 74. Maybe things would have changed up there in some capacity. But that's the beauty of this video. I just kind of wanted to focus on the Stanley Cup Finals, who made it there and had things gone a little bit different, who would have been better off in this decade. And definitely for me, I feel that the Boston Bruins would have been the team that benefited most. Instead of going 2-3, they go 5-0 and beat Montreal, beat Philly. Those are big things there. Orr's legacy obviously would be even bigger. So yeah, I know I left out a lot of big names. That does not mean I don't know that or understand there were many great players on those Boston teams. I just had to make sure this video didn't get too long. And yeah, I obviously realize there are better players or just good players on Boston's teams besides Orr and Esposito. So that's all for today's video. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. And join me hopefully again for the next part of this series, possibly tomorrow. That'll be covering a team from the 80s and what could have been for them. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you are new and enjoy this hockey content. Obviously, everybody stay safe. Have a great night. You go love hockey, all right? Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.